Alright, we are looking at chapter 14, section 3, about the Crusades. So this is just sort of an overview of the Crusades. It's not too in-depth, but it will give us a pretty good idea of what was going on. The objectives, what we're looking at here is we want to know what the cause of the Crusades were, a little bit about how each of the Crusades worked, and finally, how did the Crusades change life in Europe? So, first, how did they get started? Well, in 1095, we have Pope Urban II, who you heard about in the Dark Ages video. He called for a war. He wanted people to go to the Holy Land to recapture it for Christians. And to convince people of that, he offered an opportunity that you can save your soul if you go and fight against these horrible Muslims who are controlling the Holy Land, the place where Christ grew up, the place where Christ lived. And so he made this huge call to arms. He brought together kings and nobles and knights from all over and made one big request and said, we need to go to regain the Holy Land. And so, as Pope Urban II's official call is where this started. Now, why did he want so badly to start this crusade? Well, there were over 200 years during the Middle Ages, there were as many as 8 different big groups that traveled to the Holy Land to try to take it back. And the first one was the only one out of the 8 that was really successful. Everything else, maybe it worked out a little bit, maybe they had some good things go on, but ultimately it was only the first one that they actually gained Jerusalem. The rest of them, they'd move in, they'd maybe gain some land, and then they'd lose out as well. But then there were up to another 100 smaller groups that went over time to go and try to take over the Holy Land, and none of them really achieved much. Well, here's the reasoning for the whole crusade. That there were pilgrims. Now, not like we think of with the Mayflower. We're not talking big black hats with buckles and knickers and black vests and white bibs like you think when you think about Thanksgiving. No, pilgrim simply means somebody who travels for the purposes of religion. And so pilgrims in this case are people who were going to Jerusalem because of their Christian faith. They wanted to visit where Jesus had lived. And so for many, many years, hundreds and hundreds of years, we have thousands and thousands of Europeans who are traveling to the Holy Land as religious tourists. They want to go see where Jesus lived. And that's starting around 200 AD, so after it had taken hold in the Roman Empire, all the way up through the Middle Ages. People made it a point they wanted to go see where Jesus had lived. And this wasn't just the rich people, although there were probably more rich people than there were anybody else, just because they had more money. It's just like now, you expect people who have more money to take more vacations. But rich and poor would make the time, spend the money to go visit the Holy Land. They just wanted to see the places that were written about in the Bible. So that was one significant part of it. Another consideration was this rise of the Turks. Between 200 and 1000 AD, Jerusalem had been controlled by Arab Muslims. And generally those Arab Muslims were friendly to the European Christians. They accepted that these people were coming, and they understood that all these people coming in were tourists. They wanted to spend their money there. They would come in and buy dirt from the hill of Calvary where Jesus was crucified. They would buy stones that they were told had come off of the rock that where Jesus had been buried. They would buy water from the Dead Sea. So it was a money making prospect for them. The Arab Muslims were just fine with all of that. Now, if you remember back in a video that we watched about a month and a half ago that talked about these people, in general, the Muslims were pretty accepting of the Christians. You come in, you can live here, you can tour here, that's just fine, we'll take your money. But then there was one Muslim leader that took over in the province around Jerusalem, and he decided that he was going to burn down the Jewish temple. And that was a major problem for the Europeans. And so that was in the early 1000s when Muslim Turks took over the area. They were not as friendly. They closed down the travel by the Europeans into the region. And so they just shut the place down. You can't come in anymore. They also started taking over large areas of what used to be the Byzantine Empire. They were conquering most of the Byzantine Empire. And so at that time, the Byzantine Emperor in Constantinople, his name was Alexius, he asked Pope Urban for help. Please send me, and he was basically asking for like Navy SEALs. Send me the best of the best. I only need a few hundred guys to hold off these Muslim Turks. I just need something to help us get over this little hump that we're having a problem with. We got to be able to take those guys out, get rid of their major forces, and then we'll be fine. So just send me a couple hundred really good, strong, trained knights. And so Pope Urban II took that as an opportunity to declare, we need to fight against all Muslims in the Middle East. And that was when he made his big plea, and he asked for volunteers. And when he asked for volunteers, he got volunteers. He got a lot of volunteers. So why would they want to go to war? Well, Urban wanted the Holy Land back in Christian control. He wanted to make sure that Christians from Europe could get to the Holy Land safely. He wanted to stop all of the fighting within the European kingdoms. All of these little kingdoms and nobles and the counties were fighting against each other because they had these knights. They were well trained. They liked fighting. They were good at it, and so they wanted to try to take over more land. Well, Pope Urban wanted to stop all of this fighting. It's like fighting amongst brothers and sisters. It's just not good for the family. You know it's going to happen some, but you don't want it to happen constantly. And so he wanted to unite Europe as one, because he saw Europe as one big Holy Roman Empire. And the only way that you can get a whole lot of people who are fighting against each other to unite is to convince them that they have one common enemy. And again, it is like in a family. You got brothers and sisters who fight and fight and fight against each other. But when somebody from the outside makes fun of one, all the brothers and sisters can come together and go, hey. We can make fun of each other, but you can't make fun of him. We can pick on my little sister, but you cannot pick on my little sister. And so once everybody has a common enemy, then they unite, they come together and work together. And that is exactly what Pope Urban was asking of the European kingdoms. And then on top of that, he also wanted to have power for himself. He wanted to gain some more power, and he knew that if he could get all of these kingdoms working together, they would have to have a common leader. And he, as the Pope, would be the logical choice. Now, other Europeans, some of those kings, wanted to go and control the area in the Middle East because of where it is. It was the center of trade. We've talked about that over and over and over again. The Middle East, yeah, sure, it was a desert. Yeah, it was difficult to grow crops, but it was it was the truck stop of the of all of these trade routes. So, if you could control the Middle East, you controlled a lot of trade, and there was a lot of money to be made through the trade. You could tax everything that was going through there. And so a lot of these European kings and nobles who wanted more power, wanted more money, realized they weren't going to be able to get it just by fighting others in Europe. They were going to have to go somewhere else. And so they could go to the Middle East and take over. If you control the trade, you control the money. So, like we usually do, start here looking where we go. Goshen. And you're in the center. Straight.
These feudal lords to send their knights. Stop fighting against each other. Let's get them all together. Send them all over at once. The common people started out first because they had less to organize. They had less to prepare. Hey, if you're a peasant and you want to leave, you gather up the things that you have, which isn't much. You put them in a cart, and you go. And that's it. And if you were a craftsman, well, you shut down your business, you pick up your stuff, and you go. But if you are lord of a manor, if you are a knight, if you are a king, you have to set things up so that you're not going to lose your land while you're gone. You want to make sure that there are people in place that you can trust who are going to run things while you're away. And so common people didn't have as much trouble. They could just pick up and go. So they got as excited about this as anybody else. So the first of the Crusades is Peter the Hermit and the People's Crusade. Now, a hermit means a person that lives alone and tries not to have contact with others. You probably know the word hermit from hermit crab. A hermit crab means a crab that lives alone. It has its little shell and it hides out in there, and that's why they call it a hermit crab, because it can pull back into its shell and hide. Okay, so, hermit. We have Peter the Hermit. He had been living alone in the woods all by himself. Well, he gets together this group of commoners in 1096, and they head across Europe to Constantinople. When he gets to Constantinople, Alexius says, look, I really appreciate you all coming. That's nice of you, but you're not knights. I asked for knights. I asked for trained fighters. You just got like guys with pitchforks and axes, and that's not going to do the job. And so these people said, oh, well, I'll show you. And they got together and they just went around Constantinople and attacked the Turks anyway. They lost horribly. Horribly. Tons of people were killed. All of these people were all excited about fighting against these horrible Turks. And they weren't trained. They didn't know what they were doing. They were just running out saying, God will save, God will protect us, we'll be fine. And they ran out and attacked and lost horribly. Hundreds of people died. So, the actual First Crusade then. So remember,
Alexius is asked, can you just send me a couple hundred really well-trained knights? Well, that first group that came over had thousands and thousands of people. And it wasn't just the knights, it wasn't just those nobles, it was their families, it was their servants. They brought along serfs to help them out. Eh, If you're if you're used to being the rich noble, you don't want to worry about pulling your own goods. You've got other people to do that for you. You don't want to take care of the horses along the way. You bring other people to do that for you. And so there would be thousands and thousands of knights, and then each one of them would bring 3, 4, 5 people along as well. And they were bringing along huge portions of their household. So these knights arrive at Constantinople, and Alexius looks out, is kind of freaking out. I only asked for a couple hundred people, and look at what's here. And so he closes the gates of the city and says, y'all wait out there. And he didn't want to let them just come in. And so he holds them off. Well, these knights get there. They pick up the people that are left over from the horrible battle of the People's Crusade, and they bring them into the group as well. They train them a little bit, and these knights sitting outside are getting angry because, well, we came to help Constantinople, and they have locked us out. And so they attack the city of Constantinople. Because we came to help you, and you locked us out, so we'll show you. We're here to fight. They were excited to fight. They wanted to get this battle going. And so they decide, look, we'll attack Constantinople, take it over ourselves. And once they attacked and took over, and it took them a while, they're able to conquer Constantinople. And one of the nobles decides he's just going to stay there and rule Constantinople himself. Others then continue on and slowly move south. So it takes them a couple of months to get down to Jerusalem. So they now control Constantinople here, and they work their way across Asia Minor and down this way. They get down around Lebanon and Syria.
They start to run into a lot more defenses by the Muslims, and so they have to fight. Well, they work their way further south. Finally, they are able to get to Jerusalem, but they weren't real careful about who they were attacking. Yeah, they killed lots of Muslims, but they also killed Christians who were there. They killed Jews who'd been living there. They weren't too worried about who they were killing. They were just killing. It was kind of like a shark feeding frenzy. Once you get into it, you don't realize who you're attacking. They're just in the middle of it. They're in the moment, and they killed off a lot of people who should have been their allies. Now, after finally winning the region, they take over Jerusalem, they take over the land of Israel around it. But, once you get there, they realize, wait a minute, we're used to back home where there's green. There's trees, there's forests, there's fields. All these guys were excited to take over Jerusalem, but they weren't excited to live there and control it. Because, well, look, there's sand, rocky. You go, Europe is green and lush. It wasn't what they were hoping for, and they were stuck. Now they're in Jerusalem. They don't want to be in Jerusalem. They just want to control it so that people can come there safely. So they decide to split up the land into 4 parts. 4 little kingdoms. And it's not just around Jerusalem. There's one kingdom down here, the kingdom, the one on, and then a good portion of Asia Minor, and then the area around Constance is a kingdom. So they've broken up this central over into 4 parts. and they are controlled by 4 European kings. Well, the Muslim Turks waited, and most of these men have left, so they start to work their way back in. They start to attack all of those city-states. And they keep attacking until finally those kings realize they can't hold it anymore, and they pull out and go home. Europeans keep sending back more knights trying to take the city again and again and again, but they never do regain it completely. All the other crusades were unable to take Jerusalem back. A man called Saladin, a Muslim in Jerusalem, takes over. And he, when he is dealing with the attacks by the Europeans, Richard the Lionhearted of England is the king who is leading one of the later crusades, and they've really come to a stalemate. Saladin is controlling Jerusalem, Richard is outside of the city, and every battle it seemed like they tied. Both sides would lose the same number of men, nobody would gain any ground, and it would just bang heads over and over and over again. And Saladin and Richard ended up respecting each other an awful lot for how good of soldiers and tacticians they were. So Saladin and Richard end up working out a treaty. And the deal is that the Muslims would continue to control the city, but they would allow the Christians to come into Jerusalem and be tourists and spend their money. They spend a couple hundred years fighting, and they end up with the exact same result as how they started. Muslims controlled it, but they let the Christians come in. So what are the results? Europeans controlled Jerusalem for a little while, but they ended up losing it again. Muslims took over completely. There's lots of trade, though. The Crusaders took lots of ships to the Middle East to help transport their stuff. But they didn't want to come back home with empty boats, and so they bought a lot of stuff. They stole a lot of stuff. They loaded up their boats and sent it back home. What kind of stuff are we talking about? Rugs, spices, jewelry, glass. All of these things were exotic to the Europeans, and they're sending them back home in their big boats. People back in Europe were buying it left and right. They thought it was great stuff. They wanted more, so they opened up trade routes back to the Middle East. Ideas came back too. Remember, we had talked when we were studying the rise of Islam that the Arabs had done a lot with mathematics. Remember, algebra. And medicine. Remember, pharmacies were started. And technology. They had figured out a number of ways to use water power and steam power. And so, bringing these ideas back from the Middle East and starting to apply them in Europe. The Europeans learned a lot about shipbuilding and map making, and because they knew more about shipbuilding and map making, that allowed them to begin exploring. And that, the Crusades, what they learned from the Crusades, ended up allowing the Europeans to explore and take over huge parts of Africa, and it's what led to the Europeans discovering that the Americas existed. And so, because of the Crusades, we're here. Amazing that the first bank was started by the church because of the Crusades. The soldiers knew that it wasn't safe to carry all of their gold with them. It didn't make sense. They were traveling out through places that they didn't know. It wasn't going to be safe. They could be robbed along the way. And so the church arranged to take your money, and then when you got to your destination in the Middle East, they would give you that same amount of money back.
So it was like putting a deposit into a bank, going to another bank branch, and then taking out that money. So first banks really worked out well. It was basically like checking accounts through the church. Lots of great changes, and what directly affects you is you are here because of what was learned about shipbuilding and map making from those crusades.